Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of the Introduction to Pharmacy Law. So where we time was the quiz. So there's only 2 questions, sorry, apart from that, but it gives you an idea of the types of things we might be looking for. So question 1 was in relation to the criminal law, which one of the following is correct? So burden of proof is on the claimant, burden of proof is on the defendant, burden of proof is on the prosecution, or it's balance of probabilities. So burden of proof, the answer is obviously C because I've highlighted it, but it is on the prosecution. So the burden of proof on a claimant is in civil cases, not on the prosecution. So within the criminal law, the burden of proof is on the prosecution, and the balance of probabilities is actually a civil law case thing. The answer was C. And then question 2, which one of the following is not an article of the Human Rights Act? So it's D, which is the right to death. There is no such article within the Human Rights Act. Okay, so the next part is around, just to give you an overview around the criminal court system and the types of offences. And again, this is more kind of background knowledge, so you get an appreciation of where things can go wrong and how you may be dealt with if you are in breach of either civil law or criminal law. So the courts, generally speaking, so you've got the criminal courts. So at the bottom level, you've got the magistrates court, which here is really kind of less serious criminal cases, and they can't generally impose sentences of imprisonment more than 12 months. Usually, certainly within England and Wales, for a single offence, it's probably about 6 months. But within the criminal court, there's always a judge and some form of jury present within the criminal court. So there'll be a head judge and a jury. So within magistrates courts, there'll probably be a few people. So whenever you get a jury service call, it might be either at magistrates or Crown Court, potentially Supreme, I suppose, but certainly magistrates and Crown Court where most cases are presented. So from the magistrates court, you go to the Crown Court, which hears cases and appeals from the magistrates court, and they have greater sentences, greater powers of sentencing, and they deal with more minor and serious crimes. So, and then it kind of steps up depending on what happens or what the case is or how serious the crime is. And then obviously the highest court is the Supreme Court, and there's usually 5 judges involved there. Within the civil system, you've got the county court where there's 1 judge and no jury, so it's back to that Judge Rinder example. And they deal with small things, basically any actions involving small sums of money, and that might be, say, personal injury, employment disputes, discrimination, breach of contract, things like that. And then that again, anything that's more major gets sent up to the High Court. And again, certainly things like negligence, medical negligence, and appeals from pharmacists, for example, if it's a civil breach. And then again, highest level is the Supreme Court. But that's usually the process through the civil court. So as I said to you earlier, more civil cases are dealt with outside of the courts because it's just too costly to go through county court, high court, and so on and so forth. So most things are dealt with outside of the courts. From a kind of NHS point of view, and certainly from a GPHC point of view, there are things called tribunals. So an example is NHS tribunals who administer administrative law. So they basically have the power to enforce and exert sanctions within an administrative body rather than through the police or criminal courts. So the administrative bodies effectively are the ones that can deal with cases rather than having to go through the police or criminal courts. And they tend to be quite informal, and it usually involves a panel. So it would be a panel of your peers and some lay members who then decide what the penalty should be. So within certainly within pharmacy, again, the NHS England, we talked about the terms of service. So area teams of NHS England, they have the power to enforce the terms of service, which, as I say, set out the NHS contract for community pharmacies. Other tribunals might be employment law, education law, and then FTPs, fitness to practice, within the GPHC are a form of professional tribunal. So you'll be put in front of a panel. So this will be members of the GPHC as well as some lay members, and you state your case within that tribunal. Types of offences, there's different ones. So you've got indictable offences, which are for more serious crimes and are tried within the Crown Court by a judge and a jury. And you've got summary offences, which are less serious, and they tend to be tried within the Magistrates Court. And then you've got triable either way offences, which could be under whether they are under certain circumstances triable as either summary or indictable or both. Okay, an example of that would be if you contravene the medicines regulations, human medicines regulations, such as when you sell a pharmacy medicine from a registered pharmacy in the absence of a pharmacist. So something you'll hear more about are the responsible pharmacist regulations. So technically speaking, once a pharmacist assumes being the responsible pharmacist of a pharmacy premises, if they are absent from the pharmacy, then you are not allowed, or anybody within that pharmacy is not allowed to sell any P medicines or pharmacy medicines. If they do, then that is breaching the human medicines regulations, and that would be seen as a criminal offence because the human medicines regulations is an act, statutory law, so it would be seen as a criminal offence, and that would be triable either way, either meaning that either you'd get a fine as a minimum or imprisonment or both, depending on the severity of that thing. So a one-off instance of selling a pharmacy medicine in the absence of a pharmacist is not going to cause any problems, but if this is repeated and it happens quite often, and then potentially something happens as a result of it, then that would be seen as quite as a problem. Okay, so it'd have to be repeated sales of large quantities where patients come to harm for it to be triable either way. So as I say, a one-off incident is not going to cause a problem, but you'd have to be doing it quite a lot for it to become a problem. So criminal penalties, in terms of sentencing, there's a wide range. Minimum, it could be a discharge or a fine. Worst case scenario would be prison. So discharges, they tend to be the most lenient sentence available to a criminal court, and they tend to be for very minor offences such as minor theft or damage. So there could be absolute discharge where there's no punishment whatsoever, or it could be conditional discharge, which is basically no punishment but on the condition that that person can't commit any other offence within a set period of time. It's usually up to 3 years. So conditional discharge is basically, well, you won't get punished, but if you do something similar or you get caught again, then you'll be put back into prison for breaching that. Fines are the most common, they're easy to deal with, and then you've got other things like community orders. We've already talked about prison. Ancillary orders, so things like ASBOs or banned from driving if you're caught driving in the presence of alcohol or under the influence of alcohol. And then warnings or cautions by the police. So one thing to be aware of is that if a person refuses a caution by the police, then they may be prosecuted for the offence. So the rule of thumb there is, if you are given a warning or a caution by the police, accept it. If you refuse it, then they could prosecute you for that offence. And any warnings or cautions will come up in a DBS check. So for you guys when you're completing your DBS checks, either now or in the future, these will show up and you need to declare them. So it's best to be honest about them. Don't be afraid to divulge them. I think we'd rather you be honest about them than lie about it. Lying about it is actually worse. It's not going to necessarily affect your registration or time on the program, but you need to tell us about it. And as I say, it will come up in your DBS check anyway. What we also need to be aware of is the notifiable occupation scheme. So this relates to health professionals and occupations which carry a special trust or responsibility. So the police have a duty to share with the GPHC any convictions or other relevant information related to pharmacists. So again, if you get called up by the police for any particular thing, then they have a duty to let the GPHC know. So the GPHC won't necessarily stop you from completing the degree, but they could at point of registration prevent you from becoming a pharmacist. So that might be a point of pre-registration or after pre-registration. It depends when you've committed or broken the law. So whether it's during your undergraduate years or pre-reg, the GPHC will consider it at the point of registration. So we just need to be aware that if you are getting into trouble with the police, then as a pharmacy student and certainly as a pharmacist, the GPHC will be notified of that. Now, after a conviction, certainly after a certain period of time, specific convictions are described as spent. So basically, once a conviction becomes spent, as an individual, you don't have to disclose that information, for example, in a job application. However, as pharmacists, we are not entitled to withhold information about previous convictions, even if it was before registration as a pharmacist. So again, this applies to you guys now and over the next 4 years. We can't withhold information about previous convictions. We need to be very open and transparent about it. Again, honesty is the best policy. If you lie about it, that's going to actually be worse. Okay. So failure to disclose any conviction when applying for a job, and this is again as a health professional and as a pharmacist, can result in a fitness to practice investigation, and worst situation would be taken off the register and not be allowed to practice as a pharmacist. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And what I've done conveniently for you guys is provided a summary slide of the different types of laws, statutory and civil, and then how these are governed, what breaches are, what sanctions are available, and how you could potentially appeal them. So have a look at that in your own time, but that's a nice kind of neat way of at least looking at some of the law that are relevant to pharmacy. Okay, so this was a shorter part 2, so part 3 is coming up. So again, similarly to in the part 1, here's a couple of questions for you to look at, and I'll present the answers in part 3. So see you or speak to you shortly. Thank you guys.